University. He's a genetics beef specialist down there at Utah State University. He's been on the faculty at LSU before coming to Utah State, and then did some postdoc work at the Meat Animal Research Center in Clay Center, Nebraska, with some genetic and cytogenetic work there. So we look forward to hearing his talk this afternoon about using modern technologies and genetic testing in beef cattle selection. And so with that, Matt, I'll turn it over to you and look forward to what you have to say to us.
Okay, let's see. Hold on. Let me see if I can get this. All right. Are you seeing my presenter view, or are you seeing the actual slides?
Actual slides.
Okay, perfect. All right. So before I kind of get into it, you know, one of the things that we wanted to do here, I keep talking about modern technologies, but a lot of the technologies I'm going to be talking about today are technologies that have been around for a while, but maybe, you know, as we saw Dr. Bailey, you know, they've been used in beef cattle production, but maybe they haven't been combined in beef cattle production. So what I'm going to talk about today is kind of using these technologies to really kind of help us increase the accuracy of incorporating animals into our herds on the heifer side, but also the main one I'm going to talk about is the bull side. You know, identifying bulls that are more, you know, adaptable or more able to be productive and pass on those genetics in a rangeland setting. Now, when we're talking about, really selection, we're talking about incorporating new or replacement animals into our herd. And part of the problem with that is the animals we're usually incorporating into our herd are young, unproven animals. You know, we don't know if they're going to breed true, even with a lot of our genetic technologies and predictions that we have. Molecular technology, there's still an area of inaccuracy there. We don't know if they're going to integrate into our production system. We don't know if those genetics are going to be compatible. Sometimes we're relying on phenotype to really do that. You know, does this heifer or this bull have the proper frame size? You know, proper structure, really cover ground, things like that. And, you know, successful incorporation is vital. We have to be successful in incorporating these young animals. You know, if we're going to have improved genetic base of our herd and improve production and ultimately increase profitability for a lot of our operations. Now, on the bull side, you know, why do we put so much emphasis on the bull? Obviously, the bull, he's the vector of genetic change for our herds. You know, he can have multiple offspring every year. You know, he's going to spread his genetics all over our herd. And hopefully those genetics are compatible and productive with our system. Because if we're keeping replacements off that bull, you know, he's going to have multiple calves or influence, but that bull's incorporation and the incorporation of his genetics is going to influence our herd way past that breeding season. You know, if we're keeping heifers off of him as replacements, you know, that's a multiple year decision that we've just made, and that's a multiple year impact we've just influenced on our herd as well. Now, on the heifer side, you know, this is kind of the headache part of any beef production. Heifers are the heartbreakers of any beef production. You know, incorporating them and getting them to incorporate is a much harder thing. You know, this is our future genetic base. That cow herd is our genetic base, and by incorporating heifers or young females into this herd, we're trying to improve that genetic base. We're trying to make it more productive, make it more compatible with, you know, our production resources, while still being able to meet market demands and the demands of the market producing a product that's desirable. But it's also, you know, an instance where we're trying to get these animals to meet our production goals, you know, meet those metrics that are important for us going forward. Now, we have a ton of tools for increasing accuracy selection, you know, anything from, you know, individual data, bull performance tests, heifer development programs, even some of these genomic tests that we're seeing right now that we'll talk a little bit about today. You know, phenotype is still a very important part of our selection practices. You know, obviously cows are based off appearance, weight, things like that. We have molecular data. We even have selection indexes that incorporate molecular data now. So we can actually weight the traits that are important to us and select that animal based off of one number rather than, looking at every single trait in there, trying to figure out what we want to do. But ultimately what we're trying to do here is we're trying to identify the optimal whole animal. That's the goal. We want to look at all those traits, multiple trait selection, identify the traits that are important to us and select on all those traits rather than doing single trait selection, improving one trait till we like it and then trying to improve something else and losing the progress we got going forward. Now, this is something that, I talk a lot with producers about, and what happens when our selection doesn't match our production system. And this is why, incorporating some of these technologies and some of these genetic tests is really important. We've all seen that big, beautiful heifer that we've selected. We incorporate it. She breeds that first year. She raises a good calf. The thing is, she's using our supplementation. She's using our range for us. She's using our labor resources. And then year 2 comes around after or year 3 technically, and she's open. Now, a lot of producers say, well, maybe that was a management thing. Maybe there's something else. I still think this is a good heifer, or now she's a cow. But when she's open, she's still utilizing your production resources. And she's not paying for any of her groceries or any of yours. So she's still utilizing your supplementation program. She's still using your range resources. And basically, she's not producing anything for you. So if she's not paying for it, you could incorporate another cow in there, another heifer in there, theoretically, that could be utilizing those resources and be paying for some of the bills going forward. Now, the one thing we got to understand about genetics is, I'm a geneticist. I think genetics is important. It's not the silver bullet by any means. We still got to manage these animals. But all cows have some varying degree of genetic potential for traits. Whether it's growth, fertility, efficiency, adaptability, they have some genetic predisposition for that. The thing that we got to remember is those cows need resources to reach that genetic potential. If the resources aren't there, this superior genetics that we may have incorporated may never be realized because the resources are not there for them to realize those genetics. We need cows that are compatible with those resources to have longevity in the herd. Longevity is something that's very, very important. We need cows to get old in our production system because as they reach a certain age, that's when they start becoming profitable. If we're just incorporating new genetics every year, or we're just keeping the young animals, those animals don't reach profitability until much, much later. So, we need compatible genetics because a lot of times we'll hear, oh, you need to incorporate these genetics. These genetics are superior. Those genetics might not be compatible with your system and might not ensure success because once again, we need the resources there to really bring out that genetic potential. Now, once again, genetics are important, but compatible genetics are even more important. So it's even more important to match those genetics to your production resources. That can be your nutrition program, your animal health program. Remember, you want these animals to reach that genetic potential that you're shooting for from a production standpoint without increased or added costs to your production system. So with that being said, and that little bit of background, that quick background there, there's a difference between selection and delivery a lot of times, especially when we're talking about bulls. Now, when we're selecting traits that are important or vital for our production system, they need to be compatible to our operation once again. But just because we're really emphasizing selection on that bull, we're looking at all the traits, we're selecting off indexes, even if we're using genetic tests, that bull has to be able to deliver those genetics to those heifers, to those cows and heifers so that he's actually making an impact. And that heifer that we're implementing needs to stay in the herd in order for her, to incorporate her genetics and become profitable. So ultimately, if there's no transfer of genetics, there's no improvement. If there's a minimal transfer, you buy this great bull and you throw him out there and he's breeding 3 cows a year, you're really not going to see that huge change in your herd. Just because he's capable of transferring those genetics and he has that genetic base or that genetic package that is really desirable to your operation, is especially in the Intermountain West where we have multiple bull breeding pastures, is he actually incorporating his genetics? And on the reverse side, maybe you have a bull that you just threw out there because you needed numbers and you needed a little more bull power. Is that undesirable bull keeping others from incorporating their genetics into your herd going forward. Now, in order to incorporate his genetics, obviously we know bulls have to have certain criteria. They have to be adaptable to that production system, meaning they have to go out and they actually have to survive breeding season. They can't melt down in the first, 20, 30 days and then just stop. They need to adapt to it. They need to be productive there. They need to be able to identify females in estrus. In the Intermountain West, they need to be able to cover quite a bit of ground. They need to breed multiple females. They need to remain reproductively sound throughout the breeding season. And they need to complete these tasks in a short period of time. We're typically in the Intermountain West, we're looking at 45 to 90 days on a controlled breeding season for the most part. And, he needs to be able to do all these things. So once again, the big question in the Intermountain West, especially in multiple bull breeding pastures, is that bull actually incorporating his genetics? And which bull is actually incorporating the genetics in those multiple breed pastures? It might not be the bull you think it is. Now, bull power, this is something that really kind of inspired this first study that I'm going to talk about. This is the number of bulls needed to effectively service all cows in a herd. Now, just like everything else, there's so much gray area in what influences bull power. It could be affected by bull age. You have a bunch of older bulls and you have a younger bull in there, social dominance, libido. We know some bulls will sit there and chase cows and breed cows until, they basically fall out. They'll do it all season long. Terrain, like we just saw. If they got to cover, a large amount of terrain or difficult terrain, bull power might be decreased a little bit. Nutrition status, if that bull is able to maintain some body condition throughout the breeding season and keep breeding cows. Social status, again, pecking order. Are those old bulls driving those young bulls out, or are those young bulls just staying with the cows the entire time and breeding every opportunity they get? And then obviously breeding program and opportunity. And I'll talk about opportunity because this is something that's actually pretty important that we found going forward. Now, this is kind of, like I said, bull power is kind of this gray area. We've heard varying numbers, 1 to 20, 1 to 25, 1 to 15, 1 to 30, young bulls versus mature bulls. From a young bull perspective, and a genetics perspective, usually we're trying to keep our younger bulls from having that 1 to 25 range, just because, one, you're not sure how adaptable he's going to be during that breeding season, but two, even with his genomic predictions and genetic predictions, you're not sure what kind of calf he's going to throw. So once again, incorporating his genetics widely throughout your herd might not be the best ideal until he can kind of prove himself a little bit. Now, this study was actually inspired, the one I'm going to talk about in Utah here, was inspired by a preliminary study that I did when I was at LSU. Now, we had, like Dr. Bailey was talking about, we had much smaller breeding pastures. So we had about 40-acre breeding pastures. We had about 110 cows in these pastures and 4 bulls in there. So we were actually doing a different project, and we were looking at parentage, testing and things like that. And when we did this first study, we actually had 3 bulls in this one pasture, 2 big mature Charolais bulls and a young yearling Charolais bull. And we got the parentage data back. We noticed that one bull had sired 48 calves, one bull sired no calves, and one bull sired 12 calves. Well, it's kind of concerning because the bull that sired 48 calves in that pasture was the yearling Charolais bull. So we actually had cameras out there because that was a pasture we usually used for embryo transfer, to calve out our embryo transfers. And we were watching the video, and what would happen was that young bull would use opportunity. Remember, I was talking about opportunity. He would trail the older bull. He was using that older bull kind of as an indicator of who was in heat. And the second that older bull would go to mount that cow, he would run up and ram him. So that older bull would fall off, go limping off, and that young bull would jump up real quick, breed that cow, and take off. So he used opportunity to breed. He kind of messed up our bull power estimates there. But once again, this was in a small pasture. They didn't have to travel very far. So we wanted to replicate this study in an Intermountain West pasture that's much larger than 40 acres. Now, like I said, 1 to 25, this bull power estimate's kind of variable going forward, but we wanted to use technologies that may actually act as a tool to properly estimate bull power. Now we have these genomic technologies, we have GPS technology. We said, let's combine the two. Let's see if we can kind of track these bulls' movements, but then after that season, let's see if we can correlate back to their movements and how many calves they actually sired. So maybe it's the bull once again that's moving around. Maybe it's the bull that's laying at the water tank waiting for cows to come in. But we wanted to combine these two technologies in an Intermountain West system and see if we could actually come up with a better selection tool or a better phenotype for bull power. Now, like any good study, there were some hang-ups. So originally, we were going to use these ear tags. These are a little bit different than what Dr. Bailey talked about. I don't know if you've seen these or not, but so these ear tags, we actually used these this past year to replicate this study. So we actually put these ear tags on bulls prior to the breeding season. We collected a hair sample or ear notch when we were putting the tags in, so we could actually have DNA on the bulls. These are solar powered. So basically, we left them out on top of the barn for, I think it was 4 days to get them completely charged. And then you put them on the ear and then on the back of the ear with the solar panel. So these things will actually stay charged throughout the day. And the cool things about these was that they were satellite signals and GPS signals. So we could actually follow these bulls on this company's website in real time to see where they were and kind of doing that. We're kind of, like I said, we didn't use these the first year because they didn't come in, but we're using them now. And, for the most part, we kind of like them. But once again, there's a challenge with this. These tags are pretty heavy. So we were actually having to bring bulls back in because these tags were actually ripping ears. So what we ended up doing was we took these tags and we got what was called a Saniderm patch. Now, these are clear bandages that they use for burn victims or fresh tattoos, things like that. And what we did is we shaved a portion on the bull's back, put the tag with the solar panel up so it stayed charged, and then put this Saniderm patch on top of it since it was clear, cut a little hole in it around the solar panel so we wouldn't have any interference there. And that's what we've been using this last year. We'll actually have the data back on these bulls and the calves we start calving mid-February. So this is second year technology. Now, the first year, we're also going to use parentage testing. So for the study that we completed, we actually collected ear notches from all offspring following the first year. Now, the first year we used the GPS collars on the bulls. So the bulls were fitted with the collars, we collected hair. We let those bulls go out for breeding season. And then that subsequent calving season, we collected ear notches on all the calves, extracted DNA, and we actually did parentage testing to see which calves came from which bulls. Now, once again, challenges of research. So we fit 5 bulls with the GPS collars. One of the bulls actually lost his GPS collar. He was probably 7 days into the trial. The good news is we actually found the collar about 2 weeks ago. So we have the collar back. Now, I'm not going to present any movement data for this because we actually want to incorporate his movement into this because it's very relevant to as you'll see in the numbers here. But we actually collected biological material on 104 calves, and then we recorded movement on all the bulls as well. We extracted all the DNA at Utah State University, and we actually submitted the DNA to Neogene in Lincoln, Nebraska for parentage testing. And this actually, after talking with Neogene a little bit, this actually kind of spawned a second project that I'll talk about here in a little bit. But we actually did an identity beef profile on all the heifers. And, the reason we wanted to do that was the ranch we're working with at this time, which was on the Utah-Arizona border, was planning on they developed their own heifers based off, heifers they keep out of their own system. So we wanted to see, if we could actually apply a genomic test to those heifers and see if we can increase accuracy of selection and actually help us predict a little bit about maternal longevity in an Intermountain system. Now, when we got our parentage data back, once again, you can see there's a little bit of challenges here. Our bull one, he sired 30 calves. He was also the bull that lost his GPS collar. So that's why we're waiting to get that movement data analyzed, because he sired the most calves. The thing that we did find out here, though, was bull number 5, who only sired 2 calves. He was that young. He was about an 18-month-old bull. They had spent quite a bit of money on him. He was a very exciting bull to them, had a lot of traits they're really interested in incorporating. Once again, just because he had the ability, he didn't really incorporate his genetics into that herd that year. Now, the other hiccup we had was when we got the genetic data back, the parentage testing, we had 32 calves that were from non-conforming parentage, meaning those calves came from a bull that wasn't in our trial. So after talking with the producer, he had stated to us, yeah, there was a neighbor's bull that had crossed a fence, but he swore that he was just hanging out at the water tank for a couple days, and he kept pushing him back over, and he never really left the water tank. So the neighbor's bull actually sired 32 calves. And a lot of people say, well, this kind of ruins the trial, but I think this actually kind of gives us a better idea of what we're dealing with. These producers on this trial would have never known that neighbor's bull sired those calves. They would have been selecting genetics that, after talking with them, that they didn't really want to incorporate into their herd. So even though we had this hiccup, this actually gives us more information and probably justifies a little bit more, maybe actually validating our genetics in these herds going forward, because we might actually have calves in there, especially in the Intermountain West, where we're usually in these large pastures. We got neighbors on either side, bulls crossing ground. This might actually justify validating our genetics going forward. Now, if you remember, I talked briefly about, we conducted a identity beef test on the heifers just to kind of get an estimation of, let's see if we can have a better tool to really estimate whether these heifers are integrated or not. And the identity beef is a commercial test, and it's a test that's used to identify genetic variation to increase accuracy of selection of animals that either we're going to incorporate into our production system or animals that we're going to market. So it kind of gives us an ability to kind of select on genetic predisposition, or select on genetic markers that have been proven to be associated with specific traits that are important to our production system. Now, this test provides an index score for each set of production traits, a 1 to 10 ranking on each trait. Obviously, a larger number is better. And then at the end, it also gives an overall quartile score for predicted maternal ability. Now, the thing about this is based off a selection index. So a selection index, basically, you're assigning weighting factors to each trait based on how important you think they are. Now you can see here, and I'll go over these a little bit more. So the identity maternal index, the identity production index, and the identity terminal index, you can see here, just based off of the bars, that the traits in these are going to be weighted slightly different. Now, if you look at the maternal index, these are animals that we're looking to make mothers in our herd, to have longevity in our herd, stability. You can see that these bars here are weighted very differently than these bars over here on a terminal index. Terminal index, we're trying to put pounds on the ground, we're trying to get calves, and we're trying to market heavy calves. Nothing's really being kept as a replacement in those systems. So you can see how these traits are weighted differently. Now, that being said, before I go forward, it's also important to understand that these traits are being weighted by someone else. These traits, you may actually, for your production system, might weight these traits in importance differently than Igenity's weighting them for you. So that's something also important to consider as well. Now, the other thing to consider, and I say this, just because I think it needs to be said, nothing is universal in beef production. There is no universal optimal genetic predisposition. The optimal genetic predisposition in the Intermountain West, especially if we're looking at the Utah, Arizona Strip, New Mexico, Nevada, is very different than the optimal genetic predisposition in, say, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana. Different types of cows are going to succeed in those systems. Now, the one thing we need to understand about reproduction is it's a lowly heritable trait, meaning it's highly environmentally influenced. It's also something that, you know, just because mom was good at it doesn't mean daughters are going to be good at it. Now, reproductive efficiency, the ability of that cow to remain fertile, calve, raise a calf, rebreed again, is even lowly heritable and even more highly environmentally influenced. Now, typically what we've always been taught is with these lowly heritable traits, we're going to manage for reproduction. Essentially, we're going to give them resources so that they can reach their genetic potential for these traits. We're going to manage them into success. Now, what this identity production test may be able to do is it says it may be a good predictor of, you know, heifer selection for Utah beef systems. You know, could it be, or Intermountain West systems? You know, essentially what it's saying is we could select a genetic predisposition that could match our environmental production resources going forward. Now, what we did for this particular study, we kind of wanted to hedge our bet a little bit. We identified four ranches in southern Utah with documented productive older cows, meaning these cows had to be greater than 7 years old. And as we'll see with the numbers, these cows were actually quite a bit older than that. But they could not have missed a calf, and they had to be some of the early breeders every single year, or early calvers every single year. Now, we wanted to evaluate the identity beef test to evaluate if that maternal index and that overall quartile score. So at the end of the identity beef test, they give you a 4-star score potentially. The more stars you get, the higher overall that animal is for, you know, stability, longevity, productivity in a beef system. Now, this would actually give us the ability to identify cows having optimal genetic predisposition for longevity and heifer selection. So essentially, we could select heifers and say, okay, these heifers are going to be optimal. They should be able to integrate into our system, and they should have longevity because that's important. Oh, one thing, so basically, the reason we wanted to use these older cows was, in theory, because this test really measures stability and productivity. You know, these older cows are exactly that. You know, these are cows that have had longevity. They've been extremely productive. You know, they've really integrated into the system and are really the profitable cows in these operations going forward. So we submitted samples on these old cows, kind of pretending they're heifers, to see if they would be, you know, some of the high-ranking individuals in this test. So we randomly selected aged cows from 4 individual ranches. We had 60 total animals. The reason the numbers are different from each ranch was we adjusted because we had more samples from some ranches and less samples from other ranches. So you can see here we have a little bit of variability in the samples that we submitted going forward, but basically these cows were, you know, aged productive cows. And if we looked at the average age of cows from ranch 1 to ranch 4, you can see these cows were greater than that on average, were greater than that 7 years of age. Ranch 4 had the oldest cows in the entire group, almost 13 years of age. And ranch 2 was, you know, the second with 10 years. And then ranch 1 and 3, you know, were right up there with average age of cows being about 9 years old. Now, one thing we didn't want to look at when we got this index back was the test gives you an index for pretty much every single trait. One that we wanted to look at was milk index score. And the reason we wanted to look at that was typically animals with large genetic milk potential don't really last very long in limited environments. And the reason for that is lactation is one of the highest energy demands you can put on a cow. So if she's milking real heavy, she needs heavy nutrient, heavy forage base to really maintain that lactation and, you know, raise that calf and rebreed. Now, we got to remember too that reproduction is a luxury. If she can't maintain herself, more than likely she's not going to rebreed. Now, there are exceptions to the rule. Like Dr. Bailey showed, you know, there are those cows that can drop that body condition score, are extremely adaptable to that system, and will rebreed, you know, every single time. But this is something we wanted to look at. And if you remember, ranch number 3 had or was it ranch number 3? Ranch number 4 had the longest lived cows. They also had the lowest milk index. So we thought, okay, maybe we're on a trail here. Maybe we can actually figure something out. So we looked at stability score. So stability score, this is a genetic prediction of longevity, how long that cow's going to remain in the system. Now, this is also a highly environmentally influenced trait. Stability and longevity can be influenced by a number of things. Injury, sickness, a number of lightning strikes. There's a number of things that can influence stability in a herd. Now, our expectation is that our stability scores would be high, being that we submitted these older cows. They'd be the ones that this test would really identify. So if we look at our stability score here, you can see ranch number 1 was very average for stability with this genetic test. Ranch number 2 had the highest stability score according to this test. Ranch 3 and number 4 were kind of up there as well. But the one thing that we found interesting, remember when we looked at the initial, when we looked at age of cows, so we had this ranch here, and then we looked at milk. We thought, okay, we're on a trail here. Well, when we looked at stability index, ranch number 4 had the lowest stability index and the lowest milk production index. So right now we're starting to, okay, maybe we need to adjust the index somehow. But that wasn't the end of the story with this. So if you look here, once again, oldest cows, lowest milk index, which kind of makes sense. They're in a nutrient deficient environment. They're integrated in the system. They're able to stay there a long time. But this test is telling us that their stability is almost average. So that was a little concerning for us. It was also concerning that the second highest aged cows from ranch number 2, had the highest milk production index and then the highest stability index. So we said, okay, well, the next thing we need to do, we need to look at that final quartile score, because we're kind of, what we're doing here is we're kind of looking at, we're looking at this almost a single trait selection now. So the identity maternal index star quartile ranking is a ranking that they give you right at the beginning of this test. And it's their overall selection desirability for heifers, essentially. Basically, it takes into account all traits evaluated on multiple trait selection index, and it'll assign those cows or those heifers 1 to 4 stars, with 4 being the most optimal. And when we did this, we looked at this and we were going, wow. So ranch 3, if you remember, ranch 3 had the highest stability, or the second highest stability score, but had the lowest quartile average for heifer selection. Now I'll get into why this might be here in a second, but we kind of looked at this, and if we looked at this, going forward, ranch 4 had the highest, stability, highest quartile average. So that's saying, okay, a lot of those ranch 4 cows, those 12, almost 13-year-old cows, would have been selected in this test. Now, in these other ranches, a lot of these cows would have been culled out as heifers. Now, the identity maternal index, this is one thing that's solely based on weighted maternal traits. Now, if we look at the maternal index, ranch 4, which had the highest stability, the highest quartile ranking average, was the lowest on maternal index. So you can see here how we're kind of going back and forth, and we're going, well, we think we understand our story, but no, we're kind of confused now. So this was kind of something that we're going back and forth on. Now on the production index, this kind of, we're looking at this, and this is where you're kind of looking at index based off weighted production traits. Basically, it still incorporates stability, but you're looking more at average daily gain, weaning weight, carcass quality. So you're looking at kind of that maternal side for her to produce a calf that is going to grow and have a good final product. So if you look at that, there's really not that much difference between, obviously, ranch number 2 with that high milk production index, once again, was the highest for our identity production index going forward. Now, our quartile maternal index star ranking, what we found was this was actually a combo of both index calculations. So it actually got both of these together. We saw that our maternal traits are weighted much, much higher. So things like calving ease, stability, milk production wasn't super high, but you can see how it's a little different between the maternal index and the production index. Average daily gain on the production index is much higher than the maternal index. So you can see that these indexes, by combining these two, you really get, kind of an interesting dynamic going for that quartile ranking. Now, this is a pilot project. This isn't an end all, and everyone says, well, you're against genetic testing. I am not. I think this is the way of the future. I just think, this is something that we needed to look at, because I think this is something that, has the ability to be a tool for us going forward. If we're looking at the cows we incorporated in this study, one of the things that we would run into a problem with is if we're just using the quartile index, we're saying, okay, we're going to trust this index. We're going to look to select all our cows with 3 and 4-star rankings. About half of these cows that have been long-lived, extremely productive in the Intermountain West in these limited range environments would have been culled as heifers. And in my mind, that would have been a huge mistake. Maybe, in hindsight, maybe there were some heifers that were better that got culled that would have been incorporated better. But I think it's kind of hard to argue with a, 9, 10-year-old, 13-year-old cow that hasn't missed a calf and is bred again, to do it over again. So to kind of summarize both projects, our bull project, our goal with this and the outcome we'd like to see with this is the ability to correlate bull movement with the number of progeny sired. Because once again, he has to integrate those genetics into that herd. It'd be a new phenotype. It'd be a new trait for us to kind of more accurately predict, how those bulls are going to perform, how well they're going to be able to integrate their genetics into the herd. Is it that traveling bull, that bull that's staying with the herd the entire time? Is it that bull that lays down at the water tank and just waits for the cows to come in? Or is it that bull that's using the other bulls to as indicators to breed cows? Is it those young vigorous bulls that are getting out there chasing cows? Is it the old dominant bulls that basically exile everybody and they have that herd to themselves and they breed as they kind of get to it? Now, the next steps with this, obviously, we're doing year 2 right now. We just finished the GPS coordinates. We redid it again on that ranch on the Utah-Arizona Strip. So we'll have bull movements down there as well as parentage data. And we actually did it on our herd here at Utah State University. So we actually included a new dynamic. So we had Red Angus bulls and Santa Gertrudis bulls. We tagged all of them, sent them out. So we'll have their movements and we'll start calving out here middle of February. And we'll start getting some parentage data. So we should have, year 2 with a much larger number of offspring and bulls included in the study to kind of go forward. We'd kind of like to replicate the heifer study as well. We're doing this. We actually have collected about 200 samples of old cows that have that same production record here in Utah and Arizona. So we've collected more proven cows, about 200 more. We actually have some 2-year-olds that we're collecting samples on this week that have successfully calved, are raising that calf, and are rebred. So in theory, those are the ones that, that 3-4-year-old cows, when we start seeing some of those cows fall out. So just because, these are some cows that successfully integrated as a heifer, are now a cow and producing that second calf. So I'd be interested to see what that genetic test says about them. But then we also have a couple ranches that are going to let us sample the heifers they selected. So we'll select those heifers and we'll kind of track them for a number of years after we genetic test them to kind of see, how they do and things like that going forward. Now, looks like my slides got pulled up there. So kind of the bull management, I already talked a little about this, but obviously we want a better estimation of bull power and range pasture systems, those multiple breeding pasture systems. It might give us an idea of how to better manage those bulls during the breeding season. Maybe we need to put those young bulls in early, get them tired out, bring them back in so we can recondition, for next year, because a lot of those bulls are coming off bull tests, higher planning nutrition, then dump down on range and tend to melt a little bit. And then maybe we need to put those older bulls in later because we know that they're going to cover, and incorporate their genetics. But maybe we want to give those younger bulls that we're really excited about the potential, a chance early in the system. It might be a selection tool to identify proven breeders in the range system, those bulls that are actually going to integrate their genetics. And, obviously it might be a better tool to identify females that might be optimal. Now on our heifer selection project, this is much more complex. Like I said at the beginning of the presentation, these guys are really the headaches of every production system. They break our hearts every year. One thing that we've kind of looked at on the index, the hygienity index, is maybe we need to alter the index, weight those traits a little differently, just because, like I said before, there's no universally optimal genetics predisposition in beef production. Maybe we need to alter the genetics to mainly or more reflect the type of cow that we think is successful in our intermountain range systems. But this really is a double-edged sword. When we're looking at this, when we use the older cows, the idea was, these cows are going to get that high quartile rank and that high maternal, that high stability. And as we saw there, it was kind of variable with that small number of cows. But, it's hard because, those cows are extremely productive and extremely compatible with those production systems. And the thing is, we want old cows in our system. We want our cows to stay there and be productive and reach an age where they're profitable. But in this current test, that older set of genetics might be penalized. Those cows might have been the best heifer 10 years ago. But like I tell my producers and I tell students, the genetics you're incorporating from young animals should be your best, most improved genetics. So just think about how much we've improved genetics in 10 years. Those cows might have been optimal genetically 10 years ago, but now they're being compared to a group that has improved. So that older genetics might get penalized in this test. So they might not have that same growth potential, that same efficiency predisposition, so that same carcass ability. They might be penalized for that old genetics, but they're still there. Now, that being said, that cow, like I said, we want old genetics. A cow in an intermountain range system, it takes her 5 to 6 years before she becomes profitable. So if she's new and exciting, great genetics, but she falls out at 3 years or 4 years, that's a loss. We want those cows to get old, and we need to have that older genetics because those cows are adaptable and they can kind of figure out terrain and do a bunch of things. But we need to constantly be improving that genetic base. The other thing is we need to incorporate new genetics, and we need that new genetics to integrate so that we have, sustainability. We need constant improvement in that herd. So it's that double-edged sword of we need that old genetics in our system. We want that old genetics in the system, but we want that new genetics to incorporate and eventually kind of push out that old genetics that's been in the system for a long time. And I know that was kind of a rough and kind of fast-paced presentation about what we're doing here, but I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Matt. We really appreciate you coming and or at least participating with us and sharing the work that you're doing there in Utah. So a couple of questions came up in the Q&A and also in the chat. So one was, have you looked to see if there's a correlation between docility and the willingness of a bull to travel and breed cows?
Just anecdotally, we had a bull. I think a lot of it, and like Dr. Bailey was talking about, I think docility is a subjective, and sometimes the ranking of how docile those bulls need to be is subjective between producers. The bulls that we worked with down in Arizona, every one of those bulls was hot. I mean, if you're rating them on docility, I would say they were probably some of the most non-docile bulls I've ever seen. Now, the bulls that we have up here on campus, the one thing we did notice, we had one bull that was pretty hot, and he was a vigorous breeder. And that was just because I think he was a little bit older than the other bulls, and he was pushing people around. I don't know if it was because of docility or just his age, but yeah, we really haven't looked at it a whole lot just because of how producers really look at it.
Okay. And then Any idea why some bulls stray off by themselves?
I think it's a couple of things, and we actually had this discussion yesterday about something. I was talking with the producer about this, and I think part of it is, one part might be social dominance. He might have just gotten exiled. We didn't see the beating he took from the other bulls, so he might go off by himself. But there has been some instances, even in my personal herd back home, where you incorporate a bull, and for whatever reason the libido isn't there, whatever desire isn't there, and they just won't breed cows. So I don't know what that is.
Okay. And then a couple in the chat that says, do you have any idea on how the ranches differed in providing feed resources?
That's a great question. So the ranch number 2, those guys actually develop heifers. They keep heifers on a completely separate pasture until they're 3-year-olds, until they've had that second calf. And then they incorporate them into the cow herd. So they kind of baby them for those first 3 years. And then the ranch that had the oldest cows, it is survival of the fittest. Those heifers are incorporated. They're not bred early. They are incorporated with those cows. I mean, they'll get supplement during winter or drought summer months, but they're expected to succeed in that grazing environment.
Okay. Let's see. There was one other. Well, I'm trying to get. Oh yeah. There was a comment. It would be interesting to see the indices on cull heifers that didn't breed and rebreed. Are there any plans to look at that or that side of the equation?
Yes, and we actually, one of the ranches we're working with had a cull pen of yearlings or heifers that didn't breed. They had about 26 of them, but then they had some 2-year-olds. They had about 30 something 2-year-olds that didn't breed. So we're actually going down next week and we're going to sample them and test them as well, just to see. And honestly, that instance might be more of a management thing, which we'll have to kind of sort out. But yeah, I'd be interested to see how, those animals index, and maybe look at the ranch that really kind of babies those ones and see what those cull heifers do compared to the ones that are kind of kept in the system.
Okay.
No, that's a great idea.
Yeah, a couple, and then just one more off the chat, and then I have one. So is there a correlation between bull breed and libido? Have you seen that?
We haven't really tested that in an intermountain system. I will say this. So 3 years ago, here at Utah State, we started working with the Saniderm Patch Association, and we brought in some yearling Saniderm Patch bulls. We had 3 of them that were in a breeding pasture with some Angus influenced cows, and then our next pasture was some mature Angus bulls with the rest of the cows. Those Saniderm Patch bulls bred their herd and would cross that fence repeatedly, and probably when we parentage tested, they bred about 60% of that Angus herd as well. Now, once again, is that young, motivation, or is it breed? But I don't know. But yeah, it's definitely something I think some people have looked at. I don't know if there's ever been any true correlation to it or any standing correlation to it, but that's the only time I can think about it.
And then I guess maybe this might be the last question. So as we look at these DNA tests, so you go out and you sample the animals.
Right.
Indices are developed, and pretty much like an identity test is for cattle all across the United States. So from what you've seen and maybe what you may, I don't know, maybe didn't suggest, but at least brought up the thought of, will we ultimately see regional indexes to maybe take into account what you've kind of maybe begin to flesh out here?
I think that's exactly what needs to happen. I think that would be extreme. I think these genetic tests are extremely valuable, but I think incorporating those indices or those indexes regionally would make them even more applicable. because I mean, like I said, I don't think there's a universal genetic predisposition, optimal genetic predisposition in beef production. You know, the animal that's going to be optimal for northern Idaho is probably going to die in South Texas. So, I mean, I think the regional indexes and weighting those a little bit differently. And you know, and that's the thing that's interesting now, is because a lot of these breed associations are developing their own chips, their own genetic tests. They're specific for that breed. So maybe at some point we start incorporating all this information, doing some regional type tests. We can even, you know, be a little bit more accurate on the crossbred animals and things like that.
So I don't see any other questions that have come in. So I'll just say a thank you from the group for you being able to be here today and making the presentation. And to all the speakers, I just want to say thank you very much for taking time out of your day to be a part of our symposium. I think it's been a very informative day and a very valuable day, and I hope the participants have felt that way as well. And I just a big word of thanks to the speakers as well as to the participants. We really appreciate your time here today. Two other announcements. So early on, we talked about that you could get some continuing education credits. And if you're interested in doing that, contact Scott Jensen. And then I'm going to submit our agenda here today to the American Registry of Professional Animal Scientists. If you're a member of that group and want to get credit, if you'll give me a week or so to get that submitted to them, that'll be on their website, and you can get some credits for today's program through ARPAs if you need those credits as a registered professional animal scientist. And then one last plug, and I'll give Scott a chance to kind of say a few things. Don't forget, please, if you would, fill out the evaluations. And then one other thing, if you don't fill out, well, again, you'll probably see an email, so please fill out the evaluations either today or then. And then last question that came in, when or where will the videos from today be posted? I feel like that they will be posted on the words are leaving me here. Scott's coming to help.
It'll be on the University of Idaho Rangeland Center website.
Yeah, Rangeland Center website. And it may take a few days. We have a recording of the whole day currently. Probably what we would like to do is kind of separate those presentations out so that if you wanted to hear Dr. Garcia's talk, you could come back and watch it pretty easily, or you could see Dr. Hall's or whoever. So we plan to try and split those up. That may take us a little bit of time, but once that's done, they'll be posted on the Rangeland Center website. So